Again, want to welcome everyone. This is one of our optional CCAA meetings. We wanted to take time to dig a little bit deeper into the implementation plan requirements. We know, several of you have begun working on your implementation plans for the CCAA. We have posted some updated templates and an example implementation plan on the CCAA Toolkit, but wanted to dig a little bit deeper into both of those tools or resources and give you an opportunity also to ask us questions. We've done help desks like this in the past for the application process, other monitoring activities, those sorts of things, and have had some good success with those, or at least that's the feedback we've gotten from you all. So again, wanted to kind of take a similar approach here for the implementation plan. So just generally, for our purposes for today, we'll start off by Dan providing an overview of what the implementation plan requirements are, just as kind of a starting point, so we're all on the same page. Implementation plans are a requirement of the CCAA and must be submitted to University of Illinois Chicago within 1 year of your certificate of inclusion being finalized. And Dan will dig a little bit deeper into some of those related requirements here shortly. But we'll spend just a short time here at the beginning walking through what the requirements are for the implementation plan. Then Dan will walk through both the template that we have available on the toolkit as well as the example plan. We'll discuss some frequently asked questions that we've received and kind of how we would advise you move forward as far as steps in developing your plan, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So we've blocked off about 90 minutes today, but I think our presentation portion probably will be 30, 40 minutes, and then we can kind of spend as much or as little time at the end for your questions. So as you're going through, take note, feel free to chat questions into the chat box, or again, we can open it up for verbal discussion here at the end. So next, let's see, Dan, I will turn it over to you if you want to talk through the requirements.
Sure, thanks, Iris. Yeah, and I guess we'll start with, this is a slide I think we shared a few slide decks back about what are the requirements for enrollment in the CCAA. And we broke that up by initially what those requirements are. There's the annual requirements and then sort of the ongoing requirements kind of as needed. And going back to the initial application, which some of you have just recently completed, some of you are at the point now where you're a year into the CCAA. And so this implementation plan requirement was something that we acknowledge doing when you submit your application. It was, discussed in the CCAA itself. And so here we are. I mean, here we are at a little over a year since the CCAA has been approved and available for enrollment. And so I believe the first CIs were approved in September, if I recall correctly. So we're right on the cusp for some of the first early enrollers to undertake their implementation plan. So good timing for this here today. And so with that, because you may have thought about this a year ago and now it's here again, we wanted to take some time to do that refresh on what those requirements are. So they are first and foremost a requirement per your certificate of inclusion, or your CI as we call them. And that is specified in section 4.4 of the CCAA. So that is one of the conditions of your enrollment. We did, one of the questions we get sometimes is, well, why is this a year after the initial application? And we set that up intentionally, thinking that, like a lot of things, that first year has so much going on with learning how you're going to do tracking, how you're going to do monitoring, relaying implementation needs of different people on your crews. That's a lot in and of itself. So let's let the dust settle on some of that and then focus on institutionalizing that in your implementation plan. So that's why there's that delay. And that's why that requirement comes in down the road here. So the implementation plans, beyond just being a requirement, they're used to support the annual report review. So this is where you're including the details of how you're implementing the CCAA, and so then we have that to supplement the annual report that you submit at the end of the year to verify things were done according to the timing and requirements that you had there. It also relates to the monitoring requirements that you report on in that annual report. Specifically, we've had a lot of discussions recently about monitoring and specifically the random plot selection and that piece of it, so how you conduct the monitoring and how you select your plots, was mentioned in the CCAA in section 14.2. We've kind of reiterated that a lot with the July addendum that we just had out last month. And so, but this is the place where you document how you're approaching that. And last, as we go forward in the CCAA, when and if you ever need to respond to adaptive management triggers, the implementation plan is likely a place where we will document that type of change. And so in section 10 of the CCAA, we discussed different ways that adaptive management might influence, right, the CCAA over time. Maybe there's seasonal changes due to climate change and changing weather patterns. And so if there's timing adjustments or things like that, this is where we would document those types of changes and how they might influence some of your conservation measures. So those are the CCAA and sort of the programmatic requirements. But I think also, one of the other benefits of this is having the implementation plan institutionalize your practices. And I think we've seen that already, even just with the past few years that we've been developing the CCAA and now implementing it, right? People change roles, the responsibilities might be changed per positions, and so as your enrollment continues and as some of those requirements and responsibilities might change hands, having the implementation plan in place helps to institutionalize that and maintain that sort of program knowledge and carry that forward, which ultimately makes it easier on you and your future coworkers, as well as consistency amongst those changes. So all good reasons to do your implementation plan. So to get in a little bit more about what's involved in the plan, it's really the who, how, and what you're doing to address the requirements of the CCAA. So you did address this initially in your application. The implementation plan is sort of the next layer of detail that we want you to get into. And so first it's getting into the, who's involved with it. So what are the team roles, who within your organization or what positions are responsible for the different aspects of implementation and tracking and monitoring and reporting, all those different aspects. We'll make sure you're covering that. Next, and I just pause for a second, make sure everybody's on mute there. We are recording this for folks who can't make it today. So I just want to make you aware there. Next is how you're implementing it. And so again, you've maybe touched on a lot of this information up front in your application. You may have talked about doing conservation mowing or using idle lands, but this is where we want you to get into a little bit more detail about what does that look like? How are you going to track it? If there are things like herbicide treatments or conservation mowing, what's the timing or typical schedule that you'll be conducting those on? If you elected to participate in the sort of ramp-up period and have those intermediate targets for your first couple of years, this is also where you want to include those and discuss sort of what those targets will be and how you'll meet those. And then again, with the monitoring component, what are those random plot selection methods that you're using? And one thing we'll get into detail here is there's also an optional monitoring plan that we've developed that you can use as sort of a supplement. That's not a requirement piece if you want to capture those monitoring pieces in the plan itself, but we'll share that here shortly as well. And last is sort of the organizational pieces. So what procedures and support within your organization are you using to support your involvement in the CCAA? And there's the two aspects to that. One is, are there sort of quality assurance or quality control procedures that you use that apply to maybe some of the tracking or the reporting that you're doing, or perhaps the monitoring? And then also, is the funding that you're using for implementation? And I know, having talked to a lot of you and thought through some of that, a lot of that funding might just come from sort of department funding for your positions, your current work. Some of it's the operations and maintenance dollars to do some of the vegetation management work, those types of things. Sometimes it might be special funding requests for additional support, or specifically just for CCA involvement. So whatever that is, we want to have that sort of background in there, so we understand and others in your organization understand what's the funding and procedures that help support the CCAA implementation for your group. So next, I do want to point to, you have a template and an example that's on the toolkit. I'm going to jump over to that here shortly just to show you what that looks like. We'll walk through that briefly, and hopefully that'll help answer some questions and give you a good resource there. Before I do, I suppose, brief questions just on the background of the CCAA, or background of the implementation plan for the CCAA. Okay, no questions in the chat. So we'll move on. If you want to find out more, if you go into the CCAA itself and even just our implementation plan, that will take you to all the different places in the C software references, all these requirements. That slide I shared had a brief summary of what the requirements are, but some of the details are included in here. So just, that is a resource that you can use, and it's available. And Chris, I see your question there. That's good. We'll get to that here shortly. So let's, I'll continue on with these examples, but if you or anybody else has questions, feel free to keep chatting those in, and we'll address those here once we've gone through these examples. So to find some of these examples I'm going to share, these are all available on the toolkit. And so first, I wanted to share, if you go under the toolkit and under implementation, we have both a template. Well, there's a number of resources here, but we have a template implementation plan as well as an example. And so first, I will bring up the template just to show you what that looks like. You're not required to use this template per se, but we've taken the effort of going through, looking at what the requirements are for the implementation plan, and putting this in this format to make it as easy on you as possible. So it's there for your use, but if there's, again, for some other reason that you need to use some other format, you're welcome to do that. But the content requirements are still the same. So the first aspect, again, is the roles and responsibilities. Who are the important contacts? And so as we go through this template, you'll see this, that we have these broken up by sections with placeholders for text. And then this gray text that's included is essentially, contextual text or narrative to give you an idea of what's the type of content we're expecting there, and to help guide you through those needs. And so as we go through these, you'll see those. And again, following this, you can use those as reference notes when you begin developing your own plan. So there's the roles and responsibilities. Again, we've put some of the typical contacts of people. You don't have to have somebody for each of these, and in some cases, one person might be the contact for multiple aspects of this. But over the first year, as we've talked with many of you, it seems like there's often at least one person to fill each of these sort of roles. There's somebody to implement, do the coordination implementation within your group, who's the point person essentially to answer questions and oversee what's getting done. Of course, vegetation management is an important aspect, since that's where a lot of the conservation measures are being implemented. Environmental is often involved from the avoidance and minimization measures, as well as maybe just general compliance with the CCAA. Construction might be involved from things like feedings and how we track those under the CCAA. And then I know some organizations have had communications contacts in case they get questions or are asked to speak to their involvement in the CCAA. So just a place to capture all of that and to have that. Then next we get into the implementation details. And so first off, we have a placeholder table for important dates. And so you can essentially lay out what the annual schedule is for your organization and for everybody involved so they understand what's needed and when. And you can see an example of that here when we get to the example. But then we get into the conservation measures that you selected. So summarizing by each of those measures what you've done, how you're using the toolkit to inform those, and then getting into the specifics. So, and this is where you're getting that additional level of detail beyond what you had in your application. So in your application, if you said we're going to meet our adopted acres by doing conservation mowing and maintaining, temporary set-asides or idle lands. Well, this is when we want you to get into the details of, who's doing that mowing, when are they doing it, are you just keeping it to the windows outside of when monarchs are present? Do you plan on doing any mowing in that little summer window? And then thinking about how you'll track those. And so many of you have already done that. Again, this is just a place where you can institutionalize that. So we'll want that information for each of your conservation measures. Then we'll get into monitoring. And so this is where you can describe the training expectations, the monitoring requirements, so number of plots, how you're selecting them, when you're going to complete them, and what coordination has to happen to do that. And with that addendum that we just put out, what are those approaches that you have for both your desktop and in-field random plot selection. This is also where this CCAA monitoring plan can come in handy, and we have an example that I can share. That's also available as a template in the toolkit. I can show you where that's at shortly. But that provides, again, another framework and another template for you to be able to put that information in fairly quickly and easily. Okay, then we get into the tracking and reporting piece. And so whereas the conservation measures piece up front might start to address some of that, that's really focused above on how you're implementing those measures. So if we're doing herbicide treatments, when are those being conducted? Does that change depending on the type of treatments we're using? Again, who's doing them and where? The tracking and reporting is really, both the when you're providing the information to others within your organization, but then how you're tracking some of those different measures as well. This is also where you can summarize how you're going to account for overlap. If you happen to have other CCAA partners that overlap any of your adopted acres potentially, and then documenting how you're going to go about your annual reporting and who's involved with that. And of course, we have that spot for the adopted acre period. So if you did define that, describing again what your intermediate targets are, how you're meeting those. If you didn't do that, then there's no need to include this part in your implementation plan. And then last, we have both the funding and then those quality control details aspects that you want to document. Including with that, any revisions that you would have to your implementation plan, right? So there's that requirement to get this in by the end of year one, but over the course of your enrollment, there might be times where you need to update this. Maybe conservation measures change, maybe how you approach aspects of monitoring change. And so over time, there could be revisions to this. This is the way you can track when and what those revisions are over time. And then that makes sure that you and UIC both have the most up-to-date version. So then I'm going to pop back over here. And so again, we have this example implementation plan in the toolkit. I have it pulled up here. And so we'll go through this. And this example also has attached to it that plan example. So we'll go through both of those here briefly. at the same time. So again, it's the same example or the same template we were just looking at. We provided some example content just to give you an idea of the types of information we're looking for and the types of, you know, I guess the level of detail that you might want to include. And again, that might all differ depending on your organization, but just, again, wanted to give an example. So that summary of dates, you can see we can make that chronologically through the year. The annual report is obviously due at the start of the year. And so, you know, we start with that, but then from there, we quickly move into, like we've seen this year, into, okay, the implementation and then the monitoring piece of it, making sure that gets done. The coordination happens in the spring, the monitoring gets conducted for many of you in the summer, where that might vary where you're at, and then compiling that data and compiling all the tracking so that can go back to the coordinator for the next round of reporting. So some of these steps might be consistent for each of you, but when they differ and how you sort of divvy up the responsibilities might differ. So feel free to change that if you're looking at this example, but again, gives you something to work from. And then, like I mentioned, with the conservation measures, this is where we'll look for details on you know, what we mean by targeted herbicide use. So this is going to be targeted foliar treatments, cut stump treatments, and basal treatments. Of course, we're applying everything to label rates and methods. You know, we're going to be using our licensed and trained pesticide applicators. We could add more detail there if we want about where they're licensed or what training they receive. And then when they're doing it, we're specifying, you know, there's different times of year where we might be allowing depending on the type of treatment they're using. And then the hows, we talk about they're using hand-directed equipment to apply herbicides to the targeted vegetation, so we're minimizing the off-target applications. And then, you know, starting to get into we're tracking some of those treatments in work plans, and those work plans are going to be used then to inform the annual reporting. And so you can see that we have similar levels of detail for the native seed mixes, pesticides. So as you go through each of those, again, just spelling out the detail, how those get implemented, who does them, when, and how. On the monitoring procedures piece of this, we again summarize what the are for monitoring, how we're going about collecting that data, who's going to be collecting that data for us, and then what monitoring to occur. This does reference then an accompanying monitoring plan, which gets into the other aspects of how those plots are selected and some of the sort of more implementation pieces of the monitoring specifically. So we'll share that here shortly. And then the tracking piece, you know, they're noting here that you know, each of the conservation measures alluded to how we'll track idle land, how we'll track herbicide work, that type of thing, and that, you know, who's on first as far as that tracking goes, how that gets communicated, and then when that gets communicated back to the implementation coordinator. And so we'll carry that same sort of level of detail through on our overlap accounting, on our reporting. And so I'll let you get into more a deeper review of this as you get into preparing your own implementation plan. But I wanted to share this just so you can see what's in there and gives good food for thought as you prepare your own. So again, this is also where we can highlight what period and when we plan on you know, achieving those different targets. And in this example, thinking about funding, right, this is different places. Asset management is providing the budget for the vegetation management work. You know, this is very common to many of you. Capital projects would be where things like, you know, seed mixes and things like that would be used, where we have more ground disturbing activities. And then departmental funds might contribute to the administrative fee payment and maybe other supplemental support. So this type of format might work well for many of you, but again, might there are other funding sources at play as well. And again, if you have quality control procedures that are specific to your organization that you have to follow, you can highlight those here, as well as any revisions to the implementation plan. So this example actually we created originally in last year, right around the time of people were beginning to enroll, and then these revisions were just made here earlier this summer as we were preparing for the first round of plans. So that's the implementation plan. Again, it shouldn't be a lot of work. I think a lot, again, institutionalizing probably a lot of the work that you've done already in thinking through how you're going to implement the CCAA, and then from this first year experience, how that's worked out, some of those lessons you've learned. Let's put that to paper now so that that makes your job that much easier in the years to come. So then really briefly, this monitoring plan example that we have, we developed in collaboration and in conjunction with additional work and guidance that's been prepared for the pollinator habitat scorecard. And Iris, I know there's other guidance documents associated with the scorecard. Are those available on the website yet?
We're still working on getting the other monitoring plan guidance documents on the scorecard page. But if anyone wants copies in the interim, feel free to reach out to us directly and we can certainly provide those.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so there's other monitoring plans specific to the scorecard, but we did create one where we have overlap with the CCAA. We have one example here, and this is currently on the toolkit, specific to the CCAA. And so, again, another tool, another resource that can help you, point to the direction of what you need to provide. And so within this, it does allow you monitoring goals, which of course with the CCAA are focused on maintaining compliance, verifying that we have habitat on our adopted acres, and then when needed, informing adaptive management. And so again, guiding text in gray, and then the blue are areas that you would, as you're preparing your own plan. So this is available in this example. It's also on there as a template as well. A place to denote your management sampling objectives. So, management objective for the CCAA, if you're in the east zone, right, is to maintain greater than 6 milkweed stems on your adopted acres, your managed lands, over the course of your enrollment. And so your sampling objective then would be, right, that we want to get estimates that get you within that 90% confidence interval that you're achieving that goal. So then we have a very simple sampling design piece of this where we get into the location of your sampling, what is your data collection protocol, if we're just adhering to what's in the CCAA and that June 2021 addendum, you can note that here. You can highlight the number of plots, and again, if you're doing maybe any plots above and beyond your minimum required. What is your plot location strategy? So how are you doing that random selection from a desktop? What data collection platforms you're using ArcGIS Online or the Geospatial Habitat Database with the Survey 123 app, or if you're just using paper forms, like this is where you can document that. So again, when that time comes next year, it's all written down, you know what to do, when to do it, and so on. Notes about frequency, so if you're addressing the same plots each year, if you're moving those around, the plot selection, both, before was the desktop, here it's the in-field piece of that. Who's actually doing the data collection? So if that's occurring with other work in an area, separating that out as its own specific monitoring effort, you can capture that here. And then what's the data management reporting pieces? So some of those then get into allow room here for greater detail. Just jumping around a little bit. But for the area of interest, you can provide a narrative, or you can have a map that shows where your monitoring areas are. And I know for some of you with large territories, if you're moving that monitoring around year to year, that allows you a chance to sort of map that out so it's clear for the future. If there's specifics about the sample and when you establish your plots, how those get communicated internally between, say, like a survey manager and a data manager and the surveyors in the field, there's a procedure here, and something you might want to think about or mimic for your own use. Again, so you have this all scheduled out and planned in advance. Here we get into more detail about location selection looks like and how we're going about using that, and our procedure for doing that. Building up on the timing and frequency, getting into the equipment that's needed. So you have a checklist for any surveyors or staff going out and conducting. If there's other equipment needed or required, you can add that to some of the common things here. Again, the monitoring roles and responsibilities. So typically you'll have somebody who's in charge of overseeing the surveys, the technicians, the people out there actually conducting the surveys. Again, these may be the same people, maybe different. And the data manager, so somebody who's in charge with collecting all that data, putting it into the monitoring template, and so on. And so we have some typical roles, responsibilities described here. And again, more detail on that training that you might want to do for people going out to survey, pressure on what milkweed looks like, the difference of potential flowering nectar plants, maybe what some common nectar plants are, things like that. Any other information that you might want them to gather while they're out there. Then, what are your data management procedures? How do you want people to take the data they've collected and either save that, deliver that, compile that, and then how that ultimately then is rolled up and provided for your annual report and your CCAA monitoring. So again, this is all wrapped up into the example implementation plan. If you do want to see that monitoring plan as a template, that's also available here in the toolkit. Go to the monitoring tab. We have that monitoring protocol addendum that we just recently reviewed as a group, but the template is down here near the bottom. So this Monarch CCAA monitoring template is the version that you can use then to populate that for your own purposes. All right. So the overview of the plan and the template and the example that you have. So again, trying to make this as easy on everybody as possible, make that an easy lift. And so with that then, next steps, when you get to that time where you need to prepare this, some of you might be getting ahead of the game and doing this now. We want you to prepare that implementation plan, again, using those templates and examples as you see fit. Think about using that optional monitoring plan. When it's completed, when it's ready, we want you to email that to UIC so that they have that and can review that. We want you to send it again on or before that first year deadline, so that final signature that executes your certificate of inclusion. That's sort of the deadline for getting that in. When they get that, UIC is going to review that implementation plan, confirm it meets all those requirements of the CCAA, those earlier slides we shared that talked about sections 4.4 and section 14, that checks all those boxes and requirements there. And once they've confirmed that, you save that to your file, and then we have that. So you use it for your own internal purposes and then update it if or when needed. So as you continue on an implementation, if you decide you're maybe changing how you're going about certain activities or implementing certain things or tracking certain things, track that in the implementation plan and share those updates back with UIC. So I'll pause there. We have some questions here that we've been asked and we'll share, but I think before we get into some of this, Iris, do you want to address the questions that are in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, I think actually Chris's first question might be one of the ones that you have on the next slide, asking about,
Okay.
do we have to update the implementation plan on any sort of regular basis? Yes, there we go. So yeah, I think short answer is, we'd like that you keep the implementation plans current. So if any significant program changes or other details have changed since you originally developed the implementation plan, we'd like you to make those updates accordingly. So at whatever frequency makes sense for your program. And to provide an updated copy of the implementation plan to UIC. So we have a current copy of that for our records, but there isn't any sort of strict requirement in terms of revising or submitting a renewed implementation plan on any particular cycle. We're kind of leaving that to the partner to determine, at what point they need to make updates to their implementation plan. Is there anything you would add to that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the original intent of the implementation plans, it was, right, when we say things like targeted herbicide use, depending on where you are in the country and, what your targets are, those might be implemented in different ways or at different times. And so those are the types of things that are sort of driving what's in this. And so if there's things that change how you're implementing some of those conservation measures, or other aspects of just your administration, like if you have a new point of contact with the CCAA entity, like make those updates and pass those along.
Okay. We also have a question going back to the tracking overlapping acres. So the question is, do we only track overlapping acres between ourselves and entities that are enrolled in the CCAA, or is it overlapping with other sorts of ESA agreements, like Section 10 agreements? My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dan or Sean, I see you're online as well, is we're only tracking potential overlap of adopted acres enrolled in the Monarch CCAA. And overlap is actually allowed. There's no issue per se if there are overlapped adopted acres between partners that are enrolled in the CCAA. But at a program level, we need to account for that. And so as part of your annual reporting, you would report where and with whom you have overlapped adopted acres, and then we subtract that out at our program level accounting when we submit our annual report to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Dan or Sean, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's just overlap on adopted acres that are also in the CCAA, the Monarch CCAA. And so I just pulled up on the screen here where in the CCAA we talk about that. So it's section 14.1.1, and so that gives you some of those specifics there. Yeah, good question.
Another question, have you had any partners as of yet with overlap, for an example of how they report that or how they map that? We did have one instance of overlapped adopted acres as part of the first year annual report between a Department of Transportation and a utility company. And they had just worked together to compare their adopted acres and then had done a GIS analysis to quantify, how many acres had the potential for overlap in terms of what they were both counting as adopted acres. And they each reported that in their annual report. So I don't know if either of those organizations are on the call today and want to share how that worked or their experience with that. Feel free to speak up.
Thanks, Iris. And I'll just add that we don't have to get down to 1/10 of an acre on the overlap. They are supposed to be estimates, and I think certainly if you can figure that out with GIS, that's a great and powerful tool to do that. But the whole goal there is just so we make sure when we report back the adopted acres in the program annual report that we've accounted for, as much double counting of adopted acre overlap as possible.
Yeah, good point.
So we have a couple other frequently asked questions here, which we thought would be, maybe if you haven't thought about it yet, things you might think about, and then, it might spur other questions that you have as well. So feel free to chime in with a question or chat it in. But this first one, we addressed a little bit going through those examples that, I've heard, we described conservation measures in the application already. And so, how does that differ from what's needed in the implementation plan? And I think in short, the answer is more detail. So again, knowing that we're talking high level in the application, that we're conducting targeted herbicides, or that we're doing our temporary set-asides of habitat areas, the implementation plan is really looking into those, who's doing that, how are they tracking it, how are they implementing that, making sure it gets adhered to, when do those occur if they have a timing component, and that level of information. Iris, anything you wanted to add there?
Nope. Yeah, well explained.
Great. With that too, what if we've added or removed conservation measures since the application, right? That first year, as you get an implementation, maybe you thought you would do, all these different things. And let's say you decided, well, we're really going to focus just on our timed mowing and our idle lands. Well, if that's a decision that you're just going to do that moving forward, then you may want to consider updating that or having that specified in your implementation plan. If you don't do, let's say, targeted herbicide for 1 year, but you're going to do it again next year or sometime after, that's not something that warrants updating your implementation plan. If it's a potential measure that you are going to use, I would have that noted in your implementation plan. But over time, there might be things like, let's say, prescribed fire. That might be something that you're not using now, but it might be something that you decide you want to incorporate in your toolbox, a year or two from now. Maybe it wasn't addressed initially in your application or original implementation plan. Those are the types of things we would want you to add in and describe at that point. So that would be a trigger to include an update at some point.
And Dan, I would just add, I think you noted this on an earlier slide as well, but the implementation plan, again, isn't intended to be just a paperwork exercise. The whole idea of having an implementation plan in the CCAA was actually a recommendation that came from you all in the development of the CCAA as a way to help, again, institutionalize the practices and provide a method of documenting where and how and who is involved in implementing the CCAA, and hopefully make that process of implementing the CCAA that much smoother and more coordinated on your end. So for both of these questions, I think I would just kind of keep that in mind, that think about in terms of making updates or the level of detail you include, it's really intended to also help you within your organization, have a resource or a document that can be referenced if you have changes in personnel or, again, are busy working with other things and need a reminder for yourself in terms of what are relevant dates or timeframes that you need to be paying attention to. It's a good way to document all of those things.
Yeah, thanks, Iris. That addresses both of those questions essentially. And yeah, just these last two. So we've talked about, do you need to include the monitoring plan? You don't necessarily need to include that extra plan that we provided that template and example for, but we do need to have the details that are described in section 14.2, which is describing how you're going to select your plots, you know, when you're going to conduct your monitoring. So again, the basics of who's doing it, when they're doing it, and where they're doing it. So we want to make sure you have that at a minimum. And then last year, I'll say, you know, so does UIC or Fish and Wildlife need to approve your implementation plan? Being that this is a compliance piece of the agreement, UIC does need to at least review it and verify that it complies with what's required per the CCAA. So, you know, they have to review that, and basically they'll confirm that yes, it achieves those needs. We don't foresee Fish and Wildlife needing to review these implementation plans, assuming that they're in line with what you've had originally in your application. So the Section 7 piece is essentially, you know, consistent with what's already been provided and reviewed. You know, hopefully that should allow for you know, fairly easy, you know, and quick confirmation once you have those submitted. You know, where to go from here? You've seen this before, but you know, if you've been using it, the toolkit's where you go for all of this. So that's the template, the examples, the CCA itself, and the monitoring addendum. It's all there in the toolkit. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to Iris or I if you have more questions on any of this as you get into those details. And with that, you know, that provides the refresher and the background and the intro to those templates and examples. So from here, I believe we can take any other questions that anybody has.